Well, it looks like we've all ready to go. We've got what we're going to do is we are going to just move through the questions. There's some good questions, quite a range, which is really encouraging, and it sort of, I guess, plays into the first question there. I really enjoyed the Q&A time online, as there's more time to answer questions than during the service. Would you consider keeping it online? And it's something that certainly Lewis and I have been talking about just this week, ironically. And part of tonight was we thought we'd just see how it goes. And if there's enough people who would like to keep it going on Sunday nights, then that's certainly what we'd do. I agree that one of the things that we've been talking about was that moving to 2 services didn't really allow us time to take questions at the end of the service, because it just prolongs the finish date, and people have got a lot to get on to and all those sorts of things. And so we had been talking around the possibility of taking questions in the morning, again during the day as we have done today, and then addressing them on a Sunday night at a time which works for everybody. So let us know in the comments if you think Sunday night is a good time to go live to answer the questions, and whether you think we should do it on a, say for example, 7:30. What time do you think works well for you guys? And if you just heard a strange noise, that is the dishwasher, and I'm sorry, I should have thought to turn it off. Just a moment. Just leave it like. Thank you, my friend. Gosh, it's so good to have an assistant. Okay, so in regards to would we consider keeping questions online? Absolutely. Definitely something that we're working at, because we appreciate the extra time it gives us, and it's been apparent to us that there's been more engagement, more questions being asked by doing it this way. So let us know in the comments how you feel, and we'll go from there. Okay, there's some really good questions. Where do I start? Let me just scroll down to the bottom. Oh my gosh, they keep coming in. Okay. Often when we say we're blessed, we refer to something we have that others might not. How do we talk about our blessings without making someone else feel bad? That's a great question. I guess, and in many ways, I guess that it highlights that some things that you would consider a blessing, other people may not. They might just consider it just part of life. It's just, it's the result of their faith. It's the result of just providential circumstances, as I like to call them. And so I think that what I hear in that question is a desire not to make it sound like that God's favouring you over somebody else or anything like that. And I get that, but I'm not sure that I would necessarily be too hung up about it. If God has blessed you, and you, if circumstances are such that God has blessed you, celebrate it. Don't be afraid of it. And as I say, I think many of us talk about blessings in many different ways. I was having this discussion tonight with Miriam and Anne, and they're both car park prayers. They always pray for car parks, and they always get them. And they would consider that a blessing. And me, I just think, well, God, if you know my needs, if you're going to give me if the car park's available, that's great. If it's not, I guess I'm just going to walk further. And they just have a different attitude to me. Who's right? Who's wrong? If the truth be known, they're probably right, then I'm probably wrong. But for them, it's a blessing. And so if you're in that category where you see everyday circumstances, you can see God's hand in it, and you're thankful, don't worry about it. Just own it as it is, because it becomes an opportunity to bear witness to God. Because some people are going to look at you and go, really? That's a blessing? And you can then just talk about how, and I'm coming under conviction myself right now, how everything we have comes from God. It's God's faithfulness. We shouldn't take things for granted. And to recognize God's hand in the small things, not just the big things, is probably a good thing. So I wouldn't get hung up about it. I would just celebrate it and delight in it. I'm just suddenly feeling a little bit, maybe I should pray for car parks and more than that. I'm not being flippant. I'm just suddenly feeling, maybe I've become a little bit blasé and missing God in small things, because I'm only seeing big things or looking into big things. So thank you for that question. Okay, let me have a look here. Feelings are not facts and you don't have to act on them. You're absolutely right. Can you talk about this some more and how to control your... Okay, yes, I made this comment. I'm guessing that what this question refers to is I made this comment a couple of weeks ago, I think. I can't recall. And I talked about the difference between, about feelings and emotions and all those sorts of things. And there's another question up here as well. Feelings... Okay, let's deal with that one. Feelings are not facts, and you don't have to act on them. Can you? Can I talk about that and how to control your feelings? Okay, let me enlarge upon what I meant. What I meant by that is that feelings are just data. They're just information, or emotions. Your emotions are just raw data in a sense. And what happens is. So you experience a death, a loss, you experience pain, you experience something in your life, whether it be positive or negative, is not the issue. You have an experience, and it's just data, and then you interpret that data. So what happens is your emotions, your senses receive data, and your emotions interpret them for you. And what happens is that that's what I was referring to in terms of you don't have to act on every feeling that you have, on all the information when it comes to you via your senses. What happens is we don't have to respond straight away. In fact, my view is, and my experience is that often what happens is this data keeps coming and coming and coming and coming into our lives non-stop, and we just get so used to just interpreting it instantaneously that we never question the interpretation that's been assigned to it. And then what happens is we act on that interpretation. And so what happens is that it's because we've not reviewed or critiqued, if you will, that process, we end up getting ourselves bent out of shape. And all I was talking about was this need to try and get some distance. And if I want to control my feelings, so to speak, if I want to control how I'm going to respond to the world around me, and how am I going to respond to people, how am I going to respond to hurts, to disappointments, to things that are external to me, so to speak, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some time to think about the interpretation that I've attached to those feelings, and just question, is this valid? Do I need to act that way? Is this the appropriate response? So that I've actually just taken a step back and just putting in place a mechanism for making sure that my thought life and my actions are all healthy and are not being driven by the wrong things. So when I talk about that, that's what I was referring to. It's just data. Your feelings your feelings don't tell you that so-and-so's hurt you and therefore they're a bad person. Your feelings just tell you that that somebody said something that has lodged in your soul in an unhelpful way. What you do with it at that point is entirely up to you. Most of us just interpret it, therefore, but we don't have to. We can step back and say, actually, there might be some truth in that, or you know what? It doesn't matter. I'm not going to allow myself to be controlled or influenced by that thought. Does that make sense? That's what I was getting at with that. Okay. Gosh, these are some really great questions. Okay, so last week there was a question on why we need rules around faith, because faith is believing in Jesus. Is faith subjective or objective? That's a great question. That's a great question. Okay, so I guess what I would want to say is that all of our... The faith is objective, okay? I want to begin by saying that faith is objective. Our personal faith, and this is where we're separating out a personal faith or a personal relationship with Jesus, and a corporate faith becomes important, because when we collapse a personal relationship and Jesus and with a personal faith, and we collapse them into each other, what happens is it becomes subjective. You see, the reason I say that faith is objective is our faith is not grounded in feelings. Our faith in Jesus, our faith in who God is not based on our feelings. It's not based on how I feel in relationship to God. It's not based on all of those subjective criteria. It's rooted in objective history, if you will. It's rooted in the scriptures, which are objective. It's rooted in the historical reality of Jesus' death and resurrection, and it's rooted in something that is bigger than myself. And as a consequence, we should never downplay the objective nature of faith. The ground of our being, the ground of who we are is anchored in objectively in God. And I know that it'd be easy to say that, well, that's fine for you to say because you're a Christian, you believe in God. What about those who don't believe in God? Well, they live by faith as well. Their faith is rooted in so many things. And the question that I would put to them is, are you trying to say that my faith is subjective and yours is objective because subjective is inferior? Or are you saying that yours is subjective and mine's subjective and they're all the same? Because often what I find is that the charge of faith is subjective, so it doesn't matter what you believe. It comes from people who actually operate with a sense of objective faith. They believe the world is real, and it is, and therefore, and they begin to have these statements about it. But all of those statements came through science. They're not things that they came to for themselves generally. They're not things that they could go and say physically, this is what I believe and why, and pick something up and point to it. Their faith is in the interpretation of the world given to them through science, and so that's just as subjective as the accusation they would be making against those who say that the Bible is not real, the Bible is not this, the Bible is not that. And so really I think the starting point for us as Christians is to recognise the objectivity of our faith, and then from there begin to unpack that in terms of the scriptures. And we could spend all night just talking around how to do that, and it would be a great evening to have. Just looking at how the scriptures play out in that. So just the short answer is our faith, Christian faith, is objective. It's based on the objective reality of who God is, what He's done, and all of those sorts of things. Just as science we would call science objective in that regard. Is the meaning that we attach that's subjective? There's no question of that. Our interpretation of Scripture can be subjective at times as well. But we should. But the reason I think it's important, and I think it's a great question to ask, and it's a question I wish I'd thought about when I was preaching, is that it helps us. It helps as a safeguard against trying to get around Scripture and make God in our own image, or say, well, I don't need to believe this, I don't need to do that, because it actually nips that sort of thinking in the bud if we cultivate an understanding that God, our faith, our corporate faith, is an objective faith grounded in the objective reality of Jesus Christ and everything else. I so want to answer this in more detail. Hannah, I think Hannah's online. She moderates all this. Can you just keep these questions? I'm going to come back to this at another time. I think it's a great question. So that's what I mean. Why I answer it's objective. It is our personal approach is subjective, but our corporate faith is. Our personal approach is subjective, but our corporate faith is objective. That didn't come out very clearly, I'm sorry. Last week you mentioned different judgments. I thought the cross dealt with that. What does God judge us on and why? That's a great question. You're right that Jesus judged sin at the cross. There's no question of that. Sin has been judged at the cross, and the cross has dealt with that. But let's not confuse sin with our response to what Jesus has done and how do we live out of that. And so we see in the scriptures, for example, two different judgments in that light. We see in Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 3 and 2 Corinthians 5 from memory, where Paul talks about how as Christians, our work is going to be judged. And let's not get hung up about the timing of all this at the end times around the tribulation and everything else. And I know the timing is important, and I'm not trying to minimize that, but now's not the time to really get into it. But it talks around in those times, what's going to happen is as Christians, our work is going to be judged. How did we live our lives in the light of the knowledge that we'd received? What did we do with the gospel that had been entrusted unto us? How had we conducted ourselves? How had we lived as Jesus? All those sorts of things. Our lives are going to be judged on that. Paul's very clear in that regard. And some of us are going to receive rewards of gold and silver and hay and stubble, that type of thing, and there's crowns to be given. And the reason I say that is that yes, you're right that sin has been judged, but that doesn't give us license to then to say, well, I can live how I want. We should live with an attitude that if I'm going to live as Christ, my goal is to live in a way that will bring me to the point when I am judged before the throne of mercy, that I'm going to receive a crown. I'm not going to receive just a participation certificate, but I'm going to receive a crown. That my works are going to go through the fire and be found to be of gold or silver, that type of thing, not stubble, straw. That they are of substance, and that's one of the judgments that I was talking about in terms of last week when I talked about judgments. The Bible also talks in Revelation. Revelation 20, about the judgment then of the unbelievers. And what's being judged there, again, sin has been judged on the cross that for all time. There's no question of that. But as I said, it's our response. So as Christians, we've responded to God's grace, and our works are going to be judged. To those who have rejected God's grace, they're then judged. And they're not judged because of sin, they're judged because of their rejection of God's grace. And so we need to be clear on that. And that's why the Great Commission is so imperative, and why sharing the gospel is so important, because we want to see as many people respond so that they are not separated from God eternally in eternity, because that's what it talks about in Revelation 20, for example. And so those are the judgments. There's also some other judgments around that, judgments of the nations, and that happen as well, where the nations are judged. There's talk around other things, but I think those are the two main ones that I would want to focus on tonight, if that makes sense. If you've got questions or want further explanation, just post another question, and I'll, if we get time, I'll pick it up again. Of course, you can all tell I'm trying to avoid the one at the top. No, I'm not. It seems during lockdown that many people have got caught up in fake news and conspiracies. How would you respond? This whole fake news thing is a big deal now, isn't it? It's a very real issue that's come up since since the last American elections and everything else. And how would I respond? I think I would I think my advice to you is to be like the Bereans in Acts 17, and who basically, it talks about how they accepted what Paul had to say, but went back and measured it and assessed it and weighed it against the rest of Scripture. So that they took it at face they took it at face value, but they weren't saying, therefore that's good enough for me. They went back and they weighed it against Scripture, and they studied it, and then came up with basically fell into line. They came into agreement with it. And so I think we need to do that as well, have that attitude. So I think what it means is that for us, when we hear news items or we come across people who appear to be towing party lines, for want of a better word, or putting out propaganda, or whatever way you want to describe it, or you know people who are caught up in this whole thing of, their position is right, and that I guess we might call them the conspiracy theorists, for want of a better term. How I would approach it is that I would exercise some caution. If you've ever Googled, for example, I did this once. I Googled reasons not to drink coffee, and I put it into Google, and I said reasons not to drink coffee, and it came up with things like depression, with depression and anxiety, with affected the heart, and it affected concentration and increased mortality rates. Those sorts of things. And right there, I'm sitting there thinking that is a good reason to not drink coffee. However, just because I'm contrary like that, I then Googled reasons to drink coffee. And guess what I discovered? I discovered that the reasons to drink coffee is it lowers anxiety and stress. It actually provides health benefits to the heart, and it can prolong your life. The exact same things that the other studies said, that Google said you shouldn't drink coffee for. And really what it came down to is this. There was two very, very reputable studies that had been done that came up with this whole thing. And one of them was saying that you shouldn't drink coffee. The other was saying you should. Which one do you believe? Both of them are reputable. However, what happened is this: when I went back and had a look, the study that was referencing why it wasn't a good thing to do was that was actually in a peer-reviewed journal. There was nothing wrong with it, but it was all done on articles and studies that have been done. It hadn't been done with live subjects, so to speak. It was all what do you call it? My mind's gone blank. It was all done on articles and essays and just reviewing all of those. And so it was all theoretical. The other one was done, and it was an equally reputable essay, a study that was done of 25,000 people, and it was published. And so therefore it was done on real people. However, if my memory serves me correctly, it was done in South Korea. And so there's a whole lot of dietary things and other environmental factors that kick in there. So, and I'm just saying this because you could type in either of those and you're going to come up with some data that's going to reinforce your position. You see, the problem was not the studies. The problem was your starting point. I typed in reasons to not drink coffee, and my assumptions were validated. When I typed in reasons to drink coffee, Google did its thing with its algorithms and found me data to validate my starting point, that it's good to drink coffee. And I say that because I think that's how we approach fake news, conspiracies, and all those sorts of things. We have an assumption already operating, whether we're aware of it or not. If you are a conservative person, you tend to have an assumption or a suspicion towards those who perhaps do not share that perspective. And so therefore, when statements are made from that quarter, you judge them with a degree of suspicion. Equally, if you are from that persuasion, you would judge statements from the other side, so to speak, with a degree of suspicion. And so all I'm saying is that when you come across people who are wrestling with this or who are bought into it, the starting point is always to recognize that people have a bias, and unless you can get them to recognize that there is a bias, and I'm not saying the bias is wrong in and of itself, but to recognize the bias, then you're not going to make much progress with them at all. I think that what you've got to do is to start off with a person and say, why is this, the conversations I would have with them would be around, why is this such a big deal for you? And that's going to tell me where they're at and what their bias and everything else is. I would then, it's not going to change them, but I'm going to know where their bias is. So then I would question their sources and just say, well, so, on what basis is this, are you claiming this to be fact or whatever it is that they're claiming? And just say, well, okay, so is this a reputable, credible source? It's one of the things that amuses me at the moment, for example, is that there are a group of people who see mainstream media as the enemy at the moment, and they are very very down and very suspicious on anything that's mainstream media. And yet, when mainstream media publishes an article or says something that they agree with, suddenly they're the hero. And so all I want to do is point out to people, look, but is your source credible? Is it where's it coming from? And just get them to start asking those sorts of questions. And then that would lead on to then me asking them to question their assumptions. Why do they assume just because it's from this source that it's not credible? Why do they assume because it's from this source it's credible? And do I think I'm going to influence people doing this, by the way? No. I'm just but hopefully I plant a seed that they begin to think, because most conspiracy theorists, they just want validation. They don't actually want a conversation, because they're right and we're wrong. But I want to test their assumptions. And I guess what I'm saying this is that when you read news articles, when people talk to you, you should be doing this for yourself. What are the assumptions that they're operating with? Do I agree with those? What are my assumptions? And what are they based on, and are they valid? Where does the source come from, and is it credible? Is it verifiable, and all those sorts of things? And then just begin to address that. And from there, I would then start to have the hard conversations with people who've bought into this whole thing, for example, and just start saying to them, you know what, I love you, but I respect your right to hold your opinions, but you know what, there's just some holes in this, and just hopefully they begin to think about it. Is that helpful? Is that making sense? But I think as Christians, though, we having said that, we need to go back to the Bereans. The Bereans studied, and as Christians, it doesn't matter what the issue is, whether it be political, whether it be scientific, whether it be moral, whatever. We got to bring it back to the Scriptures. What does the Bible say? What does the Bible have to say on this topic? And am I being influenced and led, and is my behavior being shaped by that or by something else? Because I hear a lot of people talking about a lot of conspiracies, and I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? If you just went back to the Scriptures, I think you might have a lot more peace. I think you'd recognize that you're barking up the wrong tree. I think you'd recognize that, for example, that it's a fruitless exercise that you're doing, because it's not going to change anything. And the issue really is, what's this doing to your sense of well-being and your peace and your relationship with God, because you're getting so bent out of shape. It's, as Christians, we should be making sure that no matter the conspiracy theory, no matter the fake news, no matter whatever that is, when it's causing division, you know that the enemy's at work. And if it's causing division, you have not responded appropriately. Regardless of whether you are the bearer of that news or the recipient. Whereas bringing division, not disagreement based around the Scriptures, but division, I think there's an issue. So that's how I would respond. It's a lengthy answer, but it's a great question. Does that make sense? If it makes sense, can someone just give me a thumbs up? Because I can't read people's faces or anything like that. So, okay, thank you. It's really kind of weird, this interaction, but impersonal interaction. How do we look after our mental health in regards to faith? That is a really great question. How do we look after our mental health in regards to faith? What do we do when we feel like, there's another question here, what do we do when we feel like we're going through something and no one is there to help? We know God is there, but it seems no one else is. I would really love to treat these questions together because I think they're great questions, and they're really pastoral questions. And the reason I'd want to treat them together is for this reason here, is that I am passionately, absolutely wedded to this view that I am part of something bigger than myself, that I do not belong to myself. In fact, if you were to talk to Anne, and you're free to talk to Anne, and she'll be upfront with you and she'll be honest with you. All of the conflict in our marriage relationship has been when I have acted out of self-interest, when I've acted as though I don't belong to her, that we're individuals. The reality is that as a couple, we are joined as one. As Christians, we become the body of Christ. And this is why it's so important and why I'm so anti having this personal faith. It's because that so many of our mental health issues, much of our sense of isolation, so much of our struggle as Christians emanates from this whole concept of being estranged from one another because we're living in our own little spiritual bubbles, because it's between me and thee, not between me and those around me. And when we get over that and we recognize we belong to ourselves, the issue is not, am I a finger versus am I a nose? Do I have a place of prominence or a place of insignificance? That really doesn't matter, because once we belong to one another, then we're able to begin to ask for the help that we need without a sense of shame. You see, Jesus says that he comes to give life in John 10:10, but our spiritual enemy, the devil, comes to divide. And what he does is, when he divides us from one another at a most personal level, it creates this sense of isolation where we feel, if I need help and I ask for it, I'm a failure, I'm a loser, and it becomes a negative thing. Yet the reality is that when I stub my big toe does not keep quiet and think, what sort of idiot was I not to see that table leg? I'm not going to cry out to the rest of the body because I don't want it to shame me. It lets the rest of the body know, I'm in pain and I need your help right now. And the rest of the body kicks in, the adrenaline kicks in, the other toes begin to compensate and help carry the load that my foot has to carry, and then that affects all the other muscles so that I don't stumble, so I can carry on walking, and the whole body kicks in and gets behind the needs of that big toe at that point. And that should be the same for us as Christians. And so, how do we look after ourselves mentally in terms of our faith? By just being honest and real. By, when we need help, asking for help. When we've got doubts, express our doubts. The reality is that Thomas was not condemned because of his doubt. Okay, Jesus met him in his doubt, and then that led to belief. You see, doubt in itself is not terminal. But so mentally, though, if you have doubts and you don't address them, then the enemy begins to unravel your sense of well-being and just plays havoc with you. And that's why I think saying we belong to one another is so important, because it actually enables us to ask for the help that we need. But when people ask for help, we also need to respond appropriately. So, the question there was, they've gone. But how can, I can't even. The question was along the lines of what do I do when I feel so alone, because no one else is there. I know God is there, but I feel so alone. You've got to ask for help when you're struggling emotionally. You've got to ask for help. But for the rest of us, we need to respond positively as well. We've got to respond in a way that doesn't make a person feel bad, but makes a person feel good. Where a person feels a sense of relief when they cry out for help. They need to experience the very same thing that you experience in your life when God meets you where you're at and does something incredible for you. That's what they need to be as like. To be as Christ to one another is to replicate that in other people. So when people say, you know what, I'm really struggling at the moment in my marriage, I'm really struggling with my faith, I'm really struggling with whatever, our response there can never be a flicker in our eyes of, wow, you know, like, really? It's just got to be, hey, how can I help? And if we can get to that, we are so strong and we are so much ahead of the rest of the pack, so to speak, because that is not how we operate today. So that's how. So how would I look after my mental health? By taking steps to engage and by taking steps to surround myself with people who can help me, by being real, by admitting to myself my struggles, my doubts, my anxieties, and all those things. What do I do if I'm feeling so alone? Reach out and ask for help. Reach out and ask for help. You know, often it's that first step is the hardest, but when you do, in my experience, everything changes. Does that make sense? If you feel that was helpful, again, just give me a thumbs up or something, because I am flying blind here and I have no idea. Maybe it's okay. We'll see. No, maybe so. I'm taking I got that question wrong then. I didn't. I missed the sort of what was behind that. Who knows? Okay. Miriam mentioned always trusting that God will be in control. Are there practical ways I can do this? Wow, that is a good question. I wish Miriam was here. Miriam mentioned always trusting that God will be in control. Are there practical steps I can do? You know what? I think that when I think about this, I think that the best way of taking steps to believe that, practical ways that you can believe that God is in control, is to actually follow. Just simply follow, even when it doesn't make sense. You know, as I read this question, I'm reminded of Peter and when Jesus said, "Get out of the boat." At what point did the water bear his weight? You know, at what point did the water change, or did things change? Were the laws of nature suspended? Whatever happened? At what point did those things change in order for Peter to walk on that water? Did it happen before he got out, or did it happen as he got out? You see, I tend to think that most of us are waiting for our circumstances to change, and just, God, if you're there, if you're in control, just one sign and then. Whereas God just says, no, I've given you the sign, and that sign is my son. Now, I just want you to take a step and just watch me. And it's not until we take that first step that we begin to break the hold that our thoughts, that our anxieties, that our natural fears, all of those things have a hold on us. And as we take that first step, it's like stepping out onto ice, and we hear the crack and we wonder, is it going to bear our weight? And we're sort of timid, but the more that we put our weight on it, the more it may crack. But suddenly we realize it's bearing us. And at that point, everything changes, doesn't it? And so the first step is always the hardest. But so that's what I would do, is I would always just take the first step. You know, and when I talk about the first step of trusting that God is always in control, how can you build that into your life? I think, you know, sometimes what happens is that, it comes back to what I was saying before, that we tend to hold back because we're sort of waiting confirmation from God that he's already done whatever we need doing, or he's taken the first step, and then I will take the next step, and on it goes. I'll let you into a secret, if I can do that. You know, this is what it looks like for me in my life. I believe what Miriam said, absolutely. No question that God's always in control. Do I always feel that God's in control? Not always. But do I trust him? Yes. How does that translate for me in practice? when I'm making decisions, when I've got to make big decisions, I don't sit there waiting until I'm 100% certain. 51% is good enough for me. 51% is the majority. That's all I need. I just need to be on the balance of probability, so to speak. That's probably not a good term. On the balance of faith, from 1 to 100. When I hit 51, I'm good to go. Does it mean that it's always going to turn out? No. Does it mean to say that I make mistakes? No. Do I have learnings? Absolutely. But I wait till I'm 51%, and that's enough for me to actually get out of the boat and trust that God's going to do the rest. That's how it works for me. 51% is enough. Now, at that point, God begins to honour that, and more information comes into play. I get a greater sense, because I've got momentum now, that God is in control, that He's at work, and I'm able to see some things that I didn't see before, or whatever. And at that point, I'm happy to make mid-course corrections. I'm happy to step back and say, yeah, actually, maybe I got that one. You know, I didn't have all of the information that I needed, and therefore, but it's a learning process. But I'm not going to wait until I've got 100 green lights before I go. Does that make sense? So it's just living out of your faith, taking that first step. It's getting out of the boat's the hardest thing, but you've got to make a decision. And you've already made the biggest decision, the hardest decision, and that's, do I let Jesus be Lord of my life, or am I the Lord of my life? The moment you accepted Jesus as your Lord and Saviour, you handed over control. And now all you're experiencing is that ongoing struggle between relinquishing more and more and more to Jesus. But you've already done the hardest part. Now just take another step, and another step, and another step, and another step, and resist the urge to take the reins back. Does that make sense? Who's there? Thank you, Elizabeth. Liz. Thank you, Liz. How do we raise our young children to know God for themselves? What a great question. What a great question. Well, here's what I've observed, okay? Here's the lesson that I've learned as a parent, with whose kids are all grown up, and who now have done the honourable thing and given me grandkids. You know, I didn't invest in them for no reason. What I've discovered is this. Kids may not always do as you say, but they will always do as you do. They may not always do as you say, but they will always do as you do. And so therefore, if you want to bring your kids up in the ways of God, you've got to set patterns of behavior, of spiritual behavior, of spiritual discipline. You've got to set in motion practices that they can be part of, that they can experience for themselves. They've got to see you doing it, not just talking about it. So if you want your kids to grow up with a belief in Jesus, they've got to see that belief in Jesus in you. Not just hear you talking about it, but they've got to see it in you and see you living out of that. So simply talking about Jesus and the Bible, and have you had your Bible reading and all that, and then living your life as though you're free to do what you want, that's not going to convert them or win them over. They've got to see the difference it makes. They've got to see how you make your decisions. They have to see the way in which you wrestle with your faith and everything else. They've got to see you on your knees in prayer. They've got to see you reading the Bible. They've got to see you repenting. They've got to see you going to somebody and saying sorry because you were out of line, and being reconciled. They've got to see all of these things. And if you do these, then they will grow up following you. That's been my experience. It's not complicated at all. One of my sons was, for example, when he was 12, he was coming up to 12. And he came to me. We were living elsewhere. We were living over the road from our church at the time. And he said, "Dad, I want to become a man." And I thought, that's good. What am I supposed to do with this? Anyway, so I just said to him, okay, and we talked. But one of the things I said to him was, I said, okay, if you're going to become a man, you've got to learn to pray like a man. So that means every Sunday morning you've got to be over at the church with me, praying for the church at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I would not wake him up. he woke himself up. He set his alarm, and nearly every Sunday morning till we moved. And at that point we moved. He had his 15th birthday when we were moving from that place to Wellington. Nearly every Sunday morning from that point on, he was with me in church, and he was praying up a storm. He learned to pray with me. He just followed the way that I prayed. So if you hear my eldest son praying, you think, man, that is off the wall, blame me. Equally, if you think, man, what a powerful prayer, hey, I'll take the credit for that. But I just thought that's the easiest thing to do, is teach him how to be a man. Look at how I live. It also meant that I had to be very clear when I'd crossed lines, when I'd spoken inappropriately to Anne, when I had behaved inappropriately, that I took responsibility and I apologised and said, look, I was wrong. That's not how you behave. That's not what you do. That's the best advice I can give you. Just live your faith before them. Don't talk about them. If you want your kids to go to church, you got to go to church. And if you come to church, if you come to church 5 minutes late, what you're really telling your kids is that church isn't important. So don't expect them to be important for them. If you can get to every other appointment on time, if you make sure that your kids are out of bed to get to school at time, and then you are casual in your attitude towards church, why do you think that they would want to go to church? What messages are you telling them? But you're saying church is important. No, it's not. That's what the message is going through their mind. But you've got to trust Jesus, and we pray. But if they only hear you praying, and at meal times, or a formal prayer at bedtime, that's just telling them, God's just an add-on. They've got to see it lived day by day. That's the only advice I can give you in that regard. And all I can say is that it's worked for me. That and the fact that they all had a praying mother, which probably is more credit to her than it is to me. How can we prevent being bitter and disappointed towards God when we don't see changes or answers to prayer? The answer to prayers we've prayed for a long time. Wow, that is a really good question. When I read that question, what I hear is the heartache of somebody who has really wrestled for a long time in a very real, very personal area, and it just feels like God's been silent. And I want to reassure you that if that's your question and you're listening now, I want you to know that God has not been silent. God has not been ignoring you. God's not just overlooked you. The Bible's very clear that you're on his heart 24/7, that he sees your needs and he knows them even before you recognize them and give voice to them yourself. And I want you to know that even if it feels like God hasn't heard and God's not interested, that's not the case. What it tells you is that there are some circumstances, there are some circumstances that have to be worked through before God can bring you the answer in the way that you perhaps will recognize it. So often when I counsel people who reflect this type of question and this type of sentiment, and often when they're sitting in my office and they're pouring their heart out, they are really broken and just there's just a brokenness about them, because they're genuinely desiring for God to move in powerful ways, and they genuinely want to see a relationship restored or a circumstance changed, and it just seems that God hasn't done it. So the reason I say that is that we should never think that these people are difficult people, but often what I do find though is that the circumstance that has to change for God to be able to break through and to bring about the answer is often not in the circumstance or the other person or anything like that, but it's in the person who's praying. It's in the very petitioner of heaven, if you will. You see, so often what happens is we cry out to God. Let me just take a marriage, for example. So one person's crying out to God for their marriage and just lifting up their spouse and just saying, God, would you change this person? Would you do this? And it's always about God, would you, towards the other person. But the other person's only 50% of the equation. And if God was to do 100% of everything that's required in that person, that's still only half the equation. So nothing's changed. Really, in terms of your position. You see, often it's the person, the petitioner that God needs to work in. And so the reason I say that is if you're one of these people, that was your question, or people in that situation, very, very, very graciously, you need to help the person come to the point of just saying, is there stuff in my life that I need to deal with, Lord? Is there an attitude in me that needs to change? Is there something that I can do that will open up an opportunity for you to not just move in that person's life, but do something in mine so that I can see? Jesus talked about the speck in someone else's eye and the log in our own, and so often, especially when we're hurt, and we get very defensive, and what happens is we see the speck in other people's eye and we ignore the log in our own. It's just a natural defense mechanism. And so it's not that God's not working, it's that he can't do what needs to be done until you let go and you give him room. Does that make sense? And here's what I found 100% of the time. 100% of the time when I have gone down that road with people, the first response has always been, but you don't know, I have already. And they'll list a whole litany of things I've already let go of and handed over to God and everything else. And my comeback is never to say, well, that's, I didn't know that, and yeah, we've done enough. It's always, look, that's really great and I encourage you to, but maybe there's still some more stuff there that you're holding on to that you don't recognize, that's a key to unlock things, and can I pray with you about that? And generally God begins to reveal some stuff and unlock some stuff, and it's a process. It's a hurtful, it's a very intense personal process, but it's the only one I know of to come into that place where God is able to answer those prayers. And when he answers them, trust me, he's going to answer them in incredible ways. He's going to, if it's a marriage situation, you're not going to get an old marriage back. You're going to get a new marriage. If it's a circumstance that God's just not going to remove the circumstances. He's going to lift you out and give you a whole new perspective, and you're suddenly going to be in a position you never thought you'd be in a positive way. But it all begins with you humbling yourself and saying, God, I lift up and I leave before you this situation, that person. Lord, would you change me? Would you help me? Would you shine your light in my life and show me and follow it through? That's the only advice I can give you. There are no shortcuts and there are no easy answers. I'm sorry. Last question. Gosh, the time is, oh my goodness me, time has got away. Maybe doing it at night's a good idea. How can we uplift people who are personally battling with their lives, such as discovering a terminal illness at a young age? How can we encourage them spiritually? Wow. These are such good, honestly, these are such good questions. How can we, well, first of all, how can we uplift people? I think the first thing we can do is just pray for them and encourage them. One of the things that one of the things that we operate with is a very Hebrew mentality around illness in people's lives. And by that I mean, in the Old Testament, it was always thought that a person's illness, a person's misfortune, everything else was connected to was a reflection that God had rejected them. They were a bad person, therefore this was God's judgment on them, and all those sorts of stuff. And I know you don't think that, but the way in which we respond to people comes out of that. So we say, so we respond to people in a negative way. We try and be uplifting, but it actually starts off like, oh well, God knows what he's doing and everything else. And that's not a good place to start. A good place to start really is, you know what? It may not make sense to you at the moment, and I don't know what's going on, but I can tell you this, that God's love for you today is the same as it was yesterday. That the hand of God is with you now as much as it was back then, if not more now, because you need it more than you did back then. And so this, whatever you're going through, is not a reflection on your relationship with God. And just trust me on this. I was a chaplain in critical care for a period. You know, the last thing you ever want to say to someone is this: God wouldn't give you more than you can handle. Like, really? Like, what sort of God do we worship that does that? I thought he'd try and take things from us, not put more on us to see how much we can carry. So I would just encourage, I would pray with them. My advice to them is just to help them get right with God, to see that this is not a judgment, this is not a reflection on them, to build them up, to help them stay positive, not positive in terms of, you know, I know I can, I think I can type thing, but God's got this. Whether I live or die, I'm going to be with God. To live is gain, to die is gain. The whole Pauline thing is to develop that sort of mentality, and just be with them in the lows as you are in the ups, because there will be. There is no easy answers. I feel sort of inadequate response, but time is running away. We've been going an hour, and we said we'd go half an hour to 45 minutes. So thank you so much for indulging me, and just thank you for such great questions. I really appreciate it. And if you've got follow-up questions, feel free to message me, email me, and I'll respond as I can. But God bless you. I hope it was helpful. I hope you found it has not simply challenge you, but helps grow your faith and confirm your faith. And God bless you as you go into an exciting week.